Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. And here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes. I'm moving furniture around here. Thank you and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is September 11th, 2018. It is a Tuesday, and it was 17 years ago today that the attacks on New York and Washington occurred. It's hard to believe it's that many years ago, but it is. And I think everybody remembers those that are old enough to remember. Can remember exactly where they were and what they were doing on that morning. And it's really interesting because as I remembered, it was such a gorgeous morning here. And, clear and blue, and the sun was shining. And of course, it's not anything like that now. But we're all poised for the onset of the hurricane later in the week. And I think this one could be tough. And it's so wide-ranging. It's going to affect so many people that there's no way in the world to dodge it, it seems to me. I was talking to a friend this morning who has two daughters, one living in Charleston, South Carolina, the other one in Hampton, Virginia. Both of them are under evacuation orders, but in both cases, they're not moving. The daughter in Charleston, South Carolina, works at the hospital there, and they can't leave. And the one in Hampton, and of course, as we know, these are both low-lying areas. So he's worried, and but I think many of us are as well, because we're gonna take a lot. If nothing else, we're gonna take a lot of rain, and we've already taken a lot of rain. In fact, I spent a little bit of time today sweeping water out of the basement into the drain. So we took a little bit of water through the foundation yesterday because we've had so much rain already. But anyway, all we can do is worry about it. Can't do anything about it. And so all I can do is welcome you. And I think it is worthwhile to acknowledge that today is September 11th, just a horrendous day. And of course, as many people realize, we're still paying the price. We're still feeling the remnants of that attack, and unfortunately, we will be for a long time. I think that the impact that it's had not only on the nation but the world is so incredibly immense that it's going to be a day that people won't forget for a long time. I mentioned something about, for those that are old enough to remember, 17 years ago. Because a friend of mine pointed out to me the other day, and I hadn't even thought about it, but it makes perfect sense, that many of the students in the history class that I'm teaching, was a freshman class, were only like 1 or 2 years old at the time of the 9/11 attacks. They don't even remember it. So it's hard to believe. It's hard to think about dealing with people, because you mentioned that like everybody knows what it is. And the fact of the matter is, there are some people that obviously don't, that never experienced it and couldn't understand what it is. So what it refers to. That used to be true at one point with World War II, and then it was true with Korea, and then it was true with Vietnam, and on and on and on. I used to talk in class for years about the 1968 demonstrations at the Democratic Convention, because I watched every minute of it. I was frozen. I couldn't even leave the television. It was just the most amazing thing I had ever seen. And I talked about that afterwards for years, until it began to dawn on me that many of the people I was talking to, I might as well be talking about something that happened in 1768 as well as 1968. It suddenly dawned on me that this is the way the history works, and it's a reality check, as it were. Welcome to today's program on this Tuesday, the 11th day of September in the year 2018. We spent in much of our time in yesterday's program, in the last hour of it especially, talking about the issue of impeachment. I'd like to return to that issue today. I don't know whether, in fact, we'll get it completed today. I suspect we may. There's quite a bit to it. I've been pretty busy since yesterday because I've become so in talking about the issue. I've become so interested in it that I keep plowing further and further into the issue and collecting more and more information. And one of the things that I've kind of made up my mind to do is now, because we do have this outlet, which is the Virtual Center program on the internet, I feel an obligation and a sense of responsibility, but also I'm excited about the possibility as well to share some of the things that I'm finding with the folks who regularly listen to this program, because I think all of it adds to our understanding and appreciation of the issue. I think this is an important issue for a number of reasons, but I think the most obvious one is the fact that there is indeed a likelihood that this nation is going to confront the issues related to impeachment. I think the chances are pretty good that this could become a significant topic of political conversation in this country very soon. You remember we went through the impeachment debacle in the 90s with Bill Clinton. And of course, some of us can even remember the Nixon situation in 1974. I was struck last week on the final day of the Kavanaugh hearings by the appearance of John Dean from the 1974 Nixon impeachment. And Dean's position or stance on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination for the court. And what bothered John Dean particularly, of course, was Brett Kavanaugh's track record of defending the powers of the president, and basically suggesting that the president would be immune while in office from any kind of a subpoena or any kind of a criminal allegation or charge or anything else. In other words, pretty much isolating the presidency from responsibility for his behavior. And these kinds of issues have pushed me further and further into this research issue. And I kind of made a conclusion about an hour and a half ago as I was pulling much of this material together from what I got late yesterday afternoon and last evening. And then this morning, I started to pull it all together in preparation for today's program. And it began to dawn on me, I've really got to do something with this material. The time is right. The issue is there. The significance of it is clear. And it seems to me, given what we talked yesterday about that survey on the need for citizenship education, civic education, that it's more important than ever to do everything that we can do to educate the general public on the issues surrounding this kind of an important constitutional crisis. Because with social media and people's vulnerability to it today, it's too easy for people with an agenda to sell their point of view to a population that is unknowing, that is ignorant of the issues. The only way to steal people or prepare people so that they can adequately handle propaganda is through information, is through knowing what the facts are. And basically, these are the facts. And I think that kind of, in my mind, that creates a responsibility on my part that I feel unable to do anything but try to fulfill, especially given the fact that we have this outlet called the virtual center here that's available. We have the mechanism to get the information out. I've collected the information. It would seem to me sinful to not use the medium to deliver the message. And so that's what I hope to do. And that's kind of an inkling, if you will, of what I'd like to spend of the bulk of today's program on. I've got a few other things that I wanted to share that won't take all that much time, but I really wanted to devote the bulk of our program today to this particular issue. I would love to hear your thoughts on this or other issues as well. And again, let me share with you some of the basic information that we try to provide at the front end of every hour in our broadcasts, because we do want people to be able to share their thoughts with other people. That if you've got something to say and you believe it's something that other listeners ought to hear, then I think it is imperative that we have as many ways as possible for our listeners to share their thoughts, concerns, fears, hopes, convictions, whatever, with our other listeners. Just as it is equally important that our listeners have the responsibility to respond to that themselves. And I think as we get into more and more serious constitutional questions, I really believe this becomes a matter of national importance. I think it is. If you would like to come on the air and share your thoughts with us, I want to just re-emphasize, because I try to do this every day that we're on, that this is a priority of this program. If you've got something you want to say, then your ability to say it on this program is the number one priority. It's the reason that the program was created in the first place, is communication and public education. So that means that you got to have the ability, the opportunity to express yourselves, and people have to have the availability and the opportunity to have access to your thoughts and your ideas, your concerns, or whatever. And they also need to have available to them the opportunity to respond to you. If you are a regular user of Skype, then if you go on Skype and type in Bob Kincaid Horn, Horn, that will take you directly into the Head On Radio Network studios, and Agnes is there, and she'll get you on the air immediately. Or you can call in directly to the Head On Radio Network studios. We have two lines available that make this possible for you. So there are two different numbers that I want to share with you. Either one of them will work. The one that we've had for some time is area code 304-574-8178. 304-574-8178. The new number, which works equally well, is area code 304-640-2829. 304-640-2829. If you're uncomfortable or unwilling to go on the air, but you want to share your thoughts anyway, I invite you to do that. I have something to say about this in a moment. I invite you to do that by sending me an email and sharing your thoughts that way. My email address is waobrien, Obrien, 906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, Obrien, 906 @gmail.com. A third way that you can communicate is through our Facebook page. If you go to our Facebook page, which is on facebook.com, if you type in the search box at the top, the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, you'll be onto our Facebook page and you'll see a number of postings there that I put on there. And with each posting are two links. There's a share link and a comment link. If you click on the share link, then you distribute that particular posting to those who are your friends on Facebook. In other words, it basically makes what's in the postings more available to more people. Obviously, if you choose to do that and see reason to do that, I would be thankful. I would be grateful for that. The other link is a comment link. And if you comment, if you click on that link and make your comment, the comment comes directly to me. In fact, Facebook notifies me on my Facebook account that there has been a comment to a particular posting. But your comment doesn't need to pertain directly to that particular posting. If I get the alert, I'll read your comment. And if it pertains to the posting, that's fine. But if it pertains to something else related to our program, that's fine also. The key is to share your thoughts. I mentioned that I had something I wanted to say about this. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just wanted to comment on it. And I wanted people who might be listening to think about this. It's come to my attention, and I don't know how prevalent this is. I don't know how common it is. I don't know how many people this affects. But I've been told that the nature of today's political climate makes it, for many people, risky to share openly political comments for fear that there'll be retribution. Some time ago, it's probably been close to a year ago, I received word from a listener who told me, and I don't even know if it was a he or a she at this point. I'll say he, but I'm not sure. But what the listener told me was that he or she would like to sit down and make comments to me through email, but was very uncomfortable because I had a Gmail account. And that meant that what was in that Gmail account could be traced back to the sender. In other words, there was something about the very fact that my email was a Gmail account that made particular people who might use it potentially vulnerable politically. At the time, I was a little bit shocked by it, but at the same time, I really didn't understand the full ramifications of what the person was saying. But as we go on, as this controversy goes on about the person who wrote the anonymous op-ed piece in the New York Times, it's becoming very clear to me that political retribution in our society is not something that died with the McCarthy scare in the 1950s. I lived through that. I remember particular situations that happened where people were being penalized and punished for their political ideas and opinions on particular issues. I can remember, and I think I've mentioned this before on this program, I can remember sitting in a math class as an 8th grader and seeing FBI agents come into my classroom and take my math instructor by the arm and leading him out of the classroom. And we never saw that man again. I have no idea what happened to him. But he was obviously a victim because there was an article, a news item in the Boston newspapers that evening that the FBI had conducted a series of raids throughout the Boston public school systems and had made a number of arrests. And I sat there and watched one of them happen. So I know, I've seen a situation where political retribution is not just a possibility or a rumor, but actually happens. And I know that there are people listening out there who are shaking their head and saying, you don't know anything. You know, I've been in societies in other countries, for example, where political retribution can cost you your life. So this is real serious business. But somehow, living in this society, many of us have become almost immune to those kinds of fears, almost convinced that those kinds of things happen maybe somewhere else, but not here. Well, what's happening now makes it very clear that it happens here as well, because the White House is foaming at the mouth in order to find out who wrote that article. And the president has actually said that he wanted the Attorney General to turn the Justice Department loose on the person who wrote that anonymous op-ed piece, because that person was guilty of treason. Well, the fact of the matter is that's not the definition of treason, first of all. And secondly, if you think about it, we're talking about somebody who expressed or exercised their political rights under the First Amendment to share their thoughts. And what the government is talking about now is punishing them for it. So therefore, it's become clear to me that political retribution is alive and well in this country, as much as I'd like to believe that that's not true. But the fact of the matter is, people have told me, I've heard, that there are people out there listening to this program who do listen to this program on a fairly regular basis, who have been inclined to maybe call in, but have been reluctant to do so because of fears of political retribution. I don't take that comment lightly anymore. I may have before, but I don't now. And so when I tell you or say to you that we have all these vehicles for communication in order to encourage you to share your thoughts with us, I do so with the realization that for some people, this would be taking a chance. And if you're unwilling to take it, I understand that. But the fact of the matter is, if this is indeed happening, then this is yet another reason why we need to keep programs like this on the air. Because we can't cave on this. We can't back off and stop because it becomes politically uncomfortable. I think each of us has to do what we feel we must do, what we have to do. I understand that. But what I want you to understand is when I tell you that it's so easy to get on the air and you would be so welcome in all this, I fully appreciate the fact that there may be people out there that would like to do it, but for other reasons, don't do it. That doesn't for 1 second mean that I should not extend the invitation. I've always talked about in the past about the fact that there may be people out there that are reluctant to get on the air, but they would be more comfortable sending me an email. Well, then I thought back to about a year ago, and somebody told me they weren't even comfortable doing that. And given all the stuff we've seen about Facebook recently and Zuckerman's testimony before Congress and all the rest of it, before Committee of Congress and all the rest of it, it's pretty obvious that Facebook's not safe either. So I just want you to know that I understand that. And I wanted to say that because I want people out there to know that apparently it's going on. And I think we have to be very, very understanding and appreciative of the fact that we're all in different circumstances and different situations, and we have to do what's right according to what our own needs are. And I understand that. But we're talking about pretty serious stuff here. And I just want you to know that more and more I'm becoming appreciative of that fact. On the one hand, it makes me want to do more. But on the other hand, it gives me pause. Because it makes me realize just how important some of the things were. And not everything, I understand that. But, how important some of the things that we're doing here at the Virtual Center really are. And given some of the things that are happening nationally and internationally, it seems to me to be pretty important issue to kind of mention every once in a while, just to remind ourselves that this is there, we know it's there, and it may not be on the front burner all the time, but it's always there. So with that, let's get into a few things today. I mentioned that I had a couple items that I wanted to share with you briefly. And this one, the reason I mentioned this is because basically I've had it sitting here for a week and a half, 2 weeks maybe. And I thought, God, it's a short piece, but maybe, if I thought it was worthwhile, it was something very worthwhile at the time I read it, and I took the time to copy it, I darn well ought to share it with you. So let me do that very briefly. I thought it was pretty effective, pretty powerful at the time. I'll be very honest with you. It comes from a column of couple of weeks ago written by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times. We've talked about Thomas Friedman before, and I won't go into that. But this particular article dealt with the political realities of what's going on in the nation today. But it was written some time ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. But what particularly struck me about this particular piece by Tom Friedman was the introductory statements, his lead-in to the article. Because as I remember, and I don't have the full article with me now, I read it at the time, but I didn't copy the full article. It was a good one. Most of Friedman's pieces are. But what I do remember about this article is that it was different from many of the others, because about the first third of it was italicized. It was in italics. And then regular print fulfilled the rest of the article. So that by definition then, the mere fact that part of it is in italics draws your attention to it. That's the part that I reproduced and I wanted to share with you. Because what I wanted to do, and this is what appealed to me at the time I read it, how accurately, how on point Friedman is in his perspective on the way most people look at the behavior of the president. This is just a general sense. And I remember saying to myself at the time I read it, my God, he's nailed this. He's really nailed this. And right after the italics cease, he has one line after the italics which speaks to the section he's just presented in italics. And he said, my biggest challenge in writing all of the above, worrying that readers wouldn't realize that all of it was made up. So what Thomas Friedman is doing is making up news items and presenting them as we would hear them if they were coming out of Washington, out of the White House right now. And as I recall thinking, boy, has he nailed this one down. Listen to two or three of these. There's two or three of them. Just imagine that this is a news item. President Trump stopped his motorcade in Manhattan today, jumped out of his limousine, and shot a man on Fifth Avenue who was shouting anti-Trump epithets. The shooting was recorded by the White House press pool, as well as by dozens of bystanders with cell phones and by security cameras in the area. When asked for his reaction, House Speaker Paul Ryan said, "We will need more information than is available at this point," unquote. How accurate is that perspective about Paul Ryan and the way Paul Ryan deals with issues, the way he sidesteps and dodges? We've been talking about Brett Kavanaugh last week. Think about Paul Ryan over the last couple of years. This one nails it pretty well. The implication that Friedman is presenting is, if indeed that happened, this probably, most likely, would be Ryan's reaction to it. When Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell was approached on this issue, Mitch McConnell said through pursed lips that he was not going to comment on every up and down with this president, unquote. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes said he already had information indicating that the man that Trump shot worked for the Clinton Foundation and may have been a relative of former Hillary Clinton aide Huma Abedin, unquote. Again, how people in Washington supporting this particular White House are able to manipulate and come up with perspective to dodge responsibility or to somehow find ways to protect this president from allegations of anything he might do or say. And of course, Huckabee Sanders this is still going on almost daily with her press briefings. Friedman goes on. Fox News did not cover Trump's shooting at the top of its broadcast, which focused instead on the killing of an Iowa woman by an undocumented immigrant. Fox's only reference to the fact that the president had shot a man on Fifth Avenue was, quote, that a New York City man died today when he ran right into a bullet fired by the president, unquote. I thought that was pretty clever. But again, how predictable every one of these outlets is. Every one of the places that the media would go to get reaction would, Friedman thinks, say something exactly like this. And we've all been privy to it. We've all seen so much of it that I think this is particularly powerful and influential. Senator Lindsey Graham said, quote, Trump shoots as well as he putts, and that this incident would not cause the South Carolina senator to cancel his coming golf round with the president at his Bedminster, New Jersey course, unquote. White House spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee Sanders told reporters that she was looking the other way when the shooting occurred, so she didn't have any comment at all, adding, I haven't had a chance to discuss it with the president. I'll get back to you if I have something. But the president has stated many times that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. So he's just keeping a campaign promise. He didn't do anything wrong. There are no charges against him. Even though I have no comment and he has no comment, we've commented on this extensively, unquote. That is beautiful. That is absolutely beautiful. Hours later, the president tweeted, actually, some people are saying that a man who looked a lot like Barack Obama did the shooting. I'm not saying that, but some people are. It also could have been somebody sitting on their bed that weighed 400 pounds who fired the shot. Like Rudy said, truth is not truth unless I say so, unquote. And then the last one, Jerry Falwell Jr., a top evangelical leader, announced that his movement would be holding a vigil this evening, praying that the president had not stressed himself too much by having to shoot a man on Fifth Avenue. Falwell added, "This would never have happened if Jeff Sessions were doing his job." The day ended with Education Secretary Betsy DeVos declaring that the fact the president could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in broad daylight only proves again why we need to arm all our school teachers, unquote. That's all I have. But if you think about every one of those incidents, every one of those made up incidents on something that the president said he could do in a campaign speech, we begin to see pretty clearly how this administration handles all negative news. I would suggest to you that if you ever wanted a definition of political spin, this is it. Once somebody read this account, even though it's made up, there would never be a question again as to what political spin meant, because it's clearly outlined in this particular piece. I think it's great. I think it's a little bit frightening given the fact that we're talking about an administration that theoretically is accountable to the people. So again, one must think about an administration that is to be accountable to the people when every spokesman for it is manipulating the situation in such a way that the administration is able to escape scot-free from any responsibility or accountability at all for an incident that in reality would be horrendous. I was going to say it kind of speaks to how far we've come. Maybe it's better said how far we've got to go in order to basically create a real world reality which would look at that and say that's absurd. In today's political world, it's not absurd at all. So that's the issue that I wanted to share with you. And again, there's one more thing we were talking about. I'm into impeachment now. I'm not going to go back over everything we talked about yesterday, but I did want to clarify a few portions of it, maybe retouch on a few of the things that I said yesterday, and where possible, add things to them, because I've been continued to find additional things. One of the things that I had, and I've had this for a number of days, I mentioned the constitutional Harvard scholar, Cass Sunstein. And Sunstein published a book, an account on impeachment, a primer, in which he sets out to explain for citizens exactly what impeachment is about and the circumstances or the conditions under which impeachment applies and the circumstances under which it doesn't apply. And you'll recall that I mentioned this the other day. I mentioned Sunstein the other day, Sunstein rather. I'm doing disservice by mispronouncing his name. And Sunstein is the one who clearly makes the case that impeachment is a political issue, not a criminal one, not a legal one. And what he's trying to do is educate the general public on the differences between criminality and impeachability. That an issue can be impeachable even if it's not a crime, and a crime may not be impeachable. And he makes some statements in what he's written that make this point clearer than ever. And, you know, jaywalking may be a crime, but you can't be impeached under the Constitution for it. The president couldn't be impeached for jaywalking on Pennsylvania Avenue or anything like that. So once you begin to look at these extreme situations or extreme cases, it kind of becomes clear what's the point that Sunstein is trying to make. But one of the points he makes in his article, which he makes almost in passing, but I went back and was thinking about it last evening, and I began to realize that there's enough to this that it would be unfortunate to not call it to people's attention. He makes the comment that the idea of impeachment in this country goes back to the Declaration of Independence. And then he makes a comment or two as to why he believes that. I thought about that comment. Well, first of all, the reason I overlooked it, didn't make that much of it the first time, is because I had questions about it. My initial reaction is it goes back way beyond the Declaration of Independence. It goes back well into British history. In fact, if you look at Franklin on the floor of the Constitutional Convention, it goes all the way back to ancient Rome. But it goes back to the Constitutional Convention. It goes back to British law. It goes back to Blackstone and Blackstone's commentaries on the law. Because in those commentaries, Blackstone talks about what our Constitution calls high crimes and misdemeanors. And there's clear meaning to that. And that's the point. That was my reaction. So when he said it goes back to the Declaration of Independence, my initial reaction is, oh, hell, it goes back way beyond that. And then I moved on. But last evening, I was rethinking this. And I basically was asking myself, on what basis does he say that? And then I began to realize that he's absolutely right. That the Declaration of Independence reads like articles of impeachment. In effect, the Declaration of Independence, as written by Thomas Jefferson, amounted to charges of impeachment against the king. When we've dealt with the Declaration of Independence at the Virtual Center here on the air on programs, we focus principally on the philosophy, on the phrase or the paragraph dealing with the idea of unalienable truths. I have made the point, and it's valid, this is accurate, that the Congress, which approved, after many changes, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, spent almost no time on that paragraph, on the philosophy or the ideology of the Declaration of Independence, but spent most of its time on the specific charges against the king. But honestly, I had never thought of those charges in the context of impeachment. But in reality, that's Sunstein's point, and he's exactly right. Let me share, because most of us never read those charges. Actually, in terms of length, it constitutes 2/3 to even 3/4 of the entire document, the entire Declaration of Independence. 2/3 to 3/4 of it is the case against the king. That's the case that Jefferson's making to the world in order to justify the independence of the 13 colonies. Basically, what the Declaration is doing is justifying the separation from the English king because the English king has been guilty of so many violations of trust, of the trust the colonies had in him as their king, to treat them fairly and honestly and, and as full-fledged citizens of the empire and all the rest of it. And so Jefferson's case to the world is, he's the one that violated all these laws. He's the one that violated the responsibilities of his office. Therefore, independence is our only option in order to get out from under these continued violations of accountability and responsibility of the monarch. Listen to the way, and this I've copied a portion of the Declaration. I'm not going to read it all because it's fairly lengthy. It's 2/3 of the Declaration of Independence. But just to get a flavor of the kinds of things that Jefferson is saying in the Declaration, and remember, this is the Declaration as it's approved by Congress. This is not Jefferson's first draft of the Constitution, in which he has an awful lot about slavery and all the rest of it. We talked about that. Congress made him take all that out. But it's finally approved. Here's what Jefferson says after he gets beyond the section on ideology and unalienable truths and the right of the people to overthrow government and all the rest of it. Jefferson says the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then here comes the list. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. The king had the power to approve every single law passed by every single colony. We pass these laws because we need them for the public good. But he has refused to approve any of them. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. In other words, he has said the laws cannot be effected until he approves them, and then he ignores them. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He's made it so impossible for members of legislatures to get together and do business that they give up. And that's a violation of his responsibility to us. He's dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. In other words, he's denied us the right to admit immigrants into our colonies. He's obstructed the administration of justice by refusing to assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. And it goes on and on and on, one charge after the other after the other. In effect, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is a statement of impeachment. And if you look at it that way, Cass Sunstein is exactly right. I think that's extremely insightful. And I feel a little bit guilty that I missed it the first time. But the fact is, it's pretty powerful stuff. In effect, if you look at the Declaration as charges of impeachment against the king, one thing you conclude from that is proof positive that Sunstein is right, that every one of these charges speaks to a violation of the public trust, violations of the government's responsibility to us, to govern fairly, to govern appropriately, to govern on time, to respond quickly to situations. In other words, to put the public good of these colonies ahead of his own private interest. So if you want to make the case that high crimes and misdemeanors speaks principally to political issues, which is what Hamilton says in Federalist 65, then all you would need to do is cite a number of these portions of the Declaration of Independence, because what Jefferson is telling us is that impeachment is political. It deals with political responsibility and political accountability of the head of government. And that becomes the model that the founders used to insert impeachment into the Constitution of the United States 11 years later, when they write the Constitution in 1787. It's a restatement, if you will, of what Jefferson wrote in 1776. It kind of suggests or tells us exactly how the founders viewed the issue of impeachment. The reason I say that is because, as I mentioned yesterday, and I mentioned in a piece I wrote in a local paper some time ago, actually it was last year, it was right around the time that Comey was replaced, and testified in February of last year, February 2017. James Comey testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And it was a couple of weeks after that, early in March last year, that I wrote this piece. And I made the point that impeachment was political, not criminal. But my point was, and this is Sunstein's point as well, what we're facing today is an issue of spinning the situation. The president and his advisors, his legal team, are doing everything they can to convince the general public that impeachment is tied to crime, that there must be proof that the president committed a crime before he can be impeached. And that's why I wrote the article, to take issue with that assumption. And that's an important point, and I think we made that point again yesterday. And I think this is evidence of it. For more evidence of it, yesterday we went back through the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787 for particular places during that convention when impeachment was the topic of conversation, when impeachment was on the table. And we looked at a number of statements and a number of quotations from those who spoke on the issue of impeachment. And what we looked at was George Mason's concern. And first of all, we've got to realize what George Mason's concern is. George Mason is a Virginian. He's a states writer. He's very uncomfortable with the Constitution because it creates a national government so strong and so powerful potentially that it's liable to so dwarf the state powers of his state that the presidency itself becomes a virtual monarchy. And so his goal at the convention is to try to make changes in the Constitution which will reassert the power of the states and somehow weaken or reduce the powers of the central government. And when it comes to the presidency, Mason is one of those people that's concerned about the idea that the executive ought to be one person. There were many people that believed that the executive ought to be more than one person, not a committee, because everybody realizes the committees aren't ways to get things done. Committees are the way you make sure that nothing gets done. But that the executive, the chief executive, ought to be comprised of 2 or 3 people, so that in order for the executive to make a ruling, it would have to be approved by more than one person. Because what they're afraid of is that if the president is one person, then you've created the potential for another monarchy. You've created a situation where it's going to be more and more possible for the president to increase his power beyond the abilities of the checks and balances system the Constitution creates to contain such a presidency. Over the years, political scientists have been dealing with a concept they refer to as the Imperial Presidency. There have been books on it. Because of personality, certain presidents have focused principally on the powers of the executive. Others have been more reticent and are much more willing to concede to the legislative power, to the congressional power. So there have been throughout history ups and downs in the challenges between the different branches of government on the issues of power. What we're seeing right now is a situation where this president has been able to expand the idea of the imperial presidency before anything we've seen in a long time. I think we can remember that President Trump has said on more than one occasion that one of his heroes was Andrew Jackson. Because Jackson was elected as a populist. He claimed to be the voice of the common people. And they elected him. And he exercised his powers as president from the perspective that he was protecting the people against the dangers of runaway power in the hands of the establishment, in the hands of Congress, the hands of the court, etc. You can remember on the Indian decision in Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall made a decision, rendered an opinion about the fact that these Indians had rights to the land they were on, and that land grabbers were not legally empowered to take land that didn't belong to them. The land companies went to President Jackson to complain. And Jackson supported them and basically made the Indians vulnerable to the seizure of their lands by these land-hungry land grabbers in Georgia. And when it was pointed out to President Andrew Jackson that what he was doing violated the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Jackson made the statement, John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. And what he was pointing to, of course, was the fact that the judicial branch of government really didn't have any power or authority. It had to depend on power and authority from the other branches. It's not ironic then, it's not surprising that President Trump would see Andrew Jackson as one of his heroes, because President Trump was elected under very similar circumstances. He claimed to be representing the people whose voices were not being listened to against the establishment. And he, of course, painted Hillary Clinton and the leadership of the Democrats as that establishment, the so-called deep state. And he took it on in the name of the people, very much like Andrew Jackson took on his role in representing the people. Now, again, when he talks about representing the people, he's talking about white citizens of this country, not Native Americans, nor slaves. So I think that we're dealing with an imperial presidency, or the idea of an imperial presidency today. Social media has made that concern extremely more serious, because the president has the ability to immediately communicate with millions of voters, millions of citizens, instantaneously, which puts so much pressure on the other branches that it's very obvious that because Republicans control both branches, they have fallen into line and made a decision to support this president rather than to challenge him. So in effect, the checks and balances built into the system have become inoperative. And so now the question becomes, has the president taken on so many things in so many ways that violate the Constitution that, in effect, he's completed impeachable offenses, high crimes, and misdemeanors? It seems to me that the only valid way to answer that question is to go back and look at the origin of the high crimes and misdemeanors and look at what the founders say about where impeachment applies and where it doesn't, what's impeachable and what isn't. And that's what we'll do in our second hour, is go back and look not only at the Constitutional Convention, but at a number of the state ratifying conventions as well, because a number of them took up the topic of impeachment and argued for it or against it in order to try to persuade their state convention to ratify the Constitution or not ratify the Constitution, as the case may be. It seems to me, because I've looked at all of these and I'm going to share many of them with you, one of the things I've concluded is the case may not be definitive, but the issue is so broad and so significant that it raises serious impeachability questions that apply right now. And it raises serious questions about the accountability and responsibility of the President of the United States. They've been ignored. They've been overlooked. They've been suppressed. And we're going to see what we can do about that. I think we're going to take our break right now. It's a couple of minutes past the top of the hour. Actually, my clock says 4 minutes after the top of the hour. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back, and we'll still have better than 3/4 of an hour to deal with the impeachment issue. Hopefully we can finish it today, but if we don't, we'll just continue it tomorrow. I think it's that important. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Agnes, thank you very much and welcome to our second hour. It is going on 10 minutes after the hour, so we do have a little bit of an abbreviated hour, but we still have 50 minutes. And higher education in the United States tells us everything happens in 50-minute segments. Thousands and thousands of college classes and university classes run for 50 minutes 3 times a day, 3 times a week rather, and 50 minutes is considered to be the optimum time for attention span. The University of Michigan did a study some years ago, and they mentioned that that 3/4 of an hour, 50 minutes was ideal, that after that point people's attention began to wander, and by the time you got beyond an hour and 15 minutes on the same particular topic, people began to unlearn. So higher education took that to the bank, so to speak, and established the entire educational system around that particular model. Welcome to our second hour on this 9/11, September 11th edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Let me again share with you our numbers. Again, if you are a Skype user, you can go directly into our studio by typing Bob Kincaid Horn on Skype. That'll get you into the studios, and Agnes will get you on the air. Or you can call 1 or 2 lines that are available, direct lines into the studio. One of them is 304-574-8178. The other one, 304-640-2829. And other ways that you can communicate with us are via email or by Facebook. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. And on Facebook, if you go to the search box at the top of the homepage and type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, you will see a number of postings there. And if you click on one of the comment buttons with each posting, you'll be able to communicate directly with me that way. In our first hour, I spent a little bit of time talking about the significance of that and how we seem to be entering into a political situation in this country where it's becoming a little bit more and more politically dangerous to do these kinds of things. The constant attack on the media, fake news, and all that's associated with the media has been put on the defensive, and serious questions about free speech we've seen. In fact, I'm going to do a program on this pretty quickly on the Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem, and what that's become. And of course, the issues being raised surrounding the First Amendment and citizens' rights and all the rest of it. So it seems to me we are in a very, very volatile time politically in this country for a number of reasons. And I want everybody to be fully aware of that. So now that we've dealt with that, I did want to get back to our discussion of the issue of impeachment. And we spent a little bit of time on this in our first hour just before we took our break. And we kind of reestablished the idea of the political nature of impeachment, that impeachment is primarily a political tool, not a legal one. And we talked about that, and we used the Declaration of Independence, Cass Sunstein's suggestion that if one wants to understand impeachment clearly, one should look at the Declaration of Independence itself. And I think he makes a little bit of error, because when he says it goes back to Declaration, it does indeed go back before that, because if Jefferson basically wrote the Declaration of Independence almost as a set of articles of impeachment against the king, then the implication is that Jefferson must have got this perspective from somewhere. So Sunstein doesn't go back far enough. And what I wanted to share with you, I was thumbing through my notes during the break, and I picked up an item that would suggest just exactly what we're talking about here in terms of history perspective. And one of the things I've accounted or contacted is that in the year 1640, now 1640 is 20 years after the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, Mass. So this is pretty early in the nation's history. In the year 1640 in England, the House of Commons filed articles of impeachment against Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford. And among the charges against him were that he hath traitorously endeavored to subvert the fundamental laws and government of the realms, and instead thereof to introduce arbitrary and tyrannical government against law, unquote. The House of Lords convicted Strafford, and he was hanged in 1641. The issue that I would point to are the charges against Wentworth, that he traitorously endeavored to subvert the fundamental laws and the government of the realms, and instead thereof to introduce arbitrary and tyrannical government against law. To subvert fundamental law. I would suggest to you that we've more than once made the point here. James Wilson at the Constitutional Convention made this point over and over again. The Constitution of the United States is the fundamental law of the land. So if the president violates the Constitution, violates fundamental law, it's impeachable. And so I think that makes that point pretty clearly. And there's one other point that we touched upon yesterday that I wanted to add to or clarify. And this gets into the debate that broke out between George Mason and James Madison over the phrasing of the impeachment clause in the Constitution. We'll recall that when questions were raised, Madison raised the question about maladministration as being too vague and potentially too arbitrary, because it created a situation where the Senate could come up with anything and argue that it was an example of maladministration, and therefore the Senate would be able to get rid of a president. So Madison had concerns about the vagueness of the word maladministration. George Mason offered a substitute, and he talked about other high crimes and misdemeanors against the state. Remember, they had already decided on treason and bribery. And what Mason proposes is that we add other high crimes and misdemeanors against the state. Madison was satisfied with that. But Madison also had one question or one recommendation to George Mason, and George Mason readily accepted it. And that was that when you talk about high crimes and misdemeanors against the state, there's a possibility that some would interpret that as violations against one of the 13 states rather than the nation. So Madison proposed that against the state be replaced by against the United States. And Mason willingly accepted that change. So in other words, opponents of the Constitution and supporters of the Constitution, Mason being one of the leading opponents, Madison obviously being the author of the Constitution, agreed on the wording of the impeachment clause in the Constitution: bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanors against the United States. I think we touched upon that yesterday. But if you look at the Constitution today, you will not see the words against the United States in the impeachment clause in Article 2. Because at the end of the convention, what they called the Committee on Style and Revision, whose job it was to clean up the language before the Constitution was sent out to the states for approval, decided to eliminate the words against the United States. And so all that's left in the Constitution is bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And that has led to efforts by some to link impeachment with a violation of criminal law. In other words, it's made it possible for some people to make a clause which was put into the Constitution in order to avoid being vague, to become vague. If against the United States was still there, then this effort of some to link violations of the law with impeachment wouldn't be possible. In other words, this is one of the many examples in the Constitution where the language became so vague that it was open to multiple interpretations. And in this case, I think it has created more problems than it resolved. And then finally, a third item that we touched upon yesterday was the debate that broke out in the Virginia ratifying convention over the issue of the pardoning power. And right at the end of the program yesterday, I made quite a bit of this, because the president's right to pardon is becoming a frequent topic of conversation today in this country, because the media has been rumoring for a long time, has been speculating for a long time, whether in fact the president will pardon Paul Manafort, or whether he'll pardon many of the other people accused of crimes, many of them already having pled guilty to crimes. And then, of course, there's the issue of the president's right to pardon himself, which the president has asserted. And so if the president has the right to pardon himself, then I made the point yesterday, and I want to reinforce it today, that would effectively nullify the entire impeachment issue. Because you couldn't impeach the president if he had the power to impeach himself. The minute you charged him with something, he'd pardon himself for it. So obviously, the president is wrong. Obviously, the president doesn't have the right to impeach himself, because the impeachment clause is in the Constitution. By definition, if it's in the Constitution, then there was never an intent to give the president the right to pardon himself. And what has bothered me, and I mentioned this yesterday, I'll mention it again today. What has bothered me as much as anything about Brett Kavanaugh's testimony last week is that he wouldn't agree to this. He wouldn't acknowledge this. He's being nominated for the Supreme Court of the United States. It's his job to participate in determining what the law is, what the Constitution means. And yet he wouldn't take a position against the president's right to pardon himself, which is blatantly contradictory to the Constitution. And Brett Kavanaugh, of all people, must know that. That's one of the issues that scares me about Brett Kavanaugh and about his ability to be pinned down on anything. His unwillingness to take a position on Roe v. Wade? Clearly because he doesn't support it. He may tell Susan Collins that he won't do anything about it. But the fact of the matter is, the only way that you can overrule precedent is through the Supreme Court. Yes, it's established law until the Supreme Court makes the decision to change it. And that's the issue. And the reason that I'm concerned about Brett Kavanaugh's appointment confirmation is because it's very clear that he is inclined to overturn precedent. And when you do that, you are acting politically. You are politicizing the legal process. And that really concerns me, this debate over the pardoning power. So what exactly did Mason and Madison say about pardoning and about the president's right to pardon those who report to him who are accused of a crime? Mason raised the issue in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said the following: he, meaning the president, he may frequently pardon crimes which were advised by himself. If he has the power of granting pardons before indictment or conviction, may he not stop inquiry and prevent detection, unquote. If the president has the right to pardon those who are looking toward indictment or conviction of a crime, Mason is saying, couldn't the president also stop inquiry and detection into a crime? In other words, if the president's power of pardoning is unlimited, then doesn't that give the president the right to obstruct justice? That's Mason's point in the Virginia Convention. Madison was concerned because Madison wanted the president to have the pardoning power, in part because the right to pardon, he felt, was consistent with impeachment. Madison's position was that the only way you can hold the president accountable is to give him total control over the people that he hires, that he appoints, who report to him. If he's the one ultimately responsible for their behavior, then he can be impeached. Madison said during the discussion with Mason, if the president be connected in any suspicious manner with any person, and there be grounds to believe he will shelter him, the House of Representatives can impeach him. Madison's thinking is that if you're going to hold the president accountable, responsible for the people around him, then you got to give him the ability over them. You've got to give him total control over them. So he wanted the president to have the power of pardon because it made it easier to hold the president responsible for the way he used that power. In effect, what both Mason and Madison are agreeing on here is that abuse of the pardoning power is impeachable. Let me repeat that. Presidential abuse of the pardoning power is an impeachable offense. So when people talk about or speculate whether Trump's going to impeach, whether Trump is going to pardon Manafort or any of the others, the president, if he does it, is flirting with obstruction of justice. And there's evidence at the time the Constitution of the United States was ratified that the founders agreed, in this case, Mason and Madison, on opposite sides of the question of ratification, because Mason votes against ratification of the Constitution in the convention. They agree that the president can be impeached for abusing the power to pardon. Because, as Mason said, if you give the president the right to pardon, you give him the right to obstruct justice, to make it more difficult to investigate whether in fact a crime has been committed or not. So the founders didn't lightly put this stuff in the Constitution. They knew exactly what they were talking about. They knew exactly what they worried about. And what they were worried about is what we're dealing with today. There's an awful lot, a hell of a lot, of information to be gleaned from what these people thought they were doing when they validated or supported the Constitution of the United States. When they ratified the Constitution of the United States, they were creating the fundamental laws of this country, the fundamental law. And they wanted impeachment in there. And they wanted high crimes and misdemeanors in there, because they wanted to be able to get rid of a president that abused the powers of his office, obstructed justice, or did any number of other things related to violations of the public trust. One author makes the point that impeachment of a president to the founders must be available for abuses of power that subvert the Constitution, subvert the integrity of government, or subvert the rule of law. If you take those three terms, just those three terms, subverting the Constitution, subverting the integrity of government, or subverting the rule of law, you can begin to see how broad the impeachment clause is in the eyes of the founders. Yesterday, I spoke to the issue of annulment. That getting rid of the president doesn't do anything to deal with the damage the president may have created, which got him impeached. So the question is, how broadly should we look at the issue of impeachment? How broad are the responsibilities of presidential power? How wide is the area for violations or offenses that can get the president impeached? It seems to me that when you begin to look at this from the perspective of breadth, the wide range of impeachable offenses, this president is flirting with a number of them. One that we haven't mentioned, but which is specifically in the Constitution of the United States, is the emolument clause. And the questions about his hotel in D.C. and the extent to which he and his company are getting profit out of the president's position as president. And they're being openly blatant about it. The founders dealt with all of this. That's why they put emoluments in there. So the range of impeachment allegations and violations, if you look at the founders, is so broad that it is not out of the realm of possibility to link it to the idea of annulment. If you accept the fact that the president by himself, without people supporting him, couldn't really do serious damage to the Constitution of the United States all by himself, he would have to have other people there. And then you make the allegations or the responsibilities or the points of accountability for the president as broad as you can. You're talking about impeachment involving getting rid of all the negative impact or outcomes or effects of impeachable presidential behavior. Just bouncing him out of office is not nearly enough. You got to be able to get rid of the other people. You got to be able to undo the damage that they were able to do. It seems to me that a detailed account and analysis of what the founders believed impeachment covered, you can make a solid legal case for the issue of annulment. Let me demonstrate some of this by sharing with you some of the statements from leaders in the state ratifying conventions. This is in North Carolina. The issue, a one-person president. The issue that the president ought to be just one person. Hamilton and the Constitutional Convention made the argument that the president needed to be one person because it was much easier to hold one person accountable for behavior in office than it was to hold several people accountable. Hamilton said, it is far more safe that there should be a single object for the jealousy and watchfulness of the people. All multiplication of the executive is rather dangerous than friendly to liberty. The more people you include in the executive branch of government, the more difficult it is for the people to hold the executive accountable, and the more dangerous it is to the people's freedom in this country. And that argument worked. The Constitution of the United States created the presidency as we know it now. In North Carolina, in the ratification debates, James Iredell, who played a leading role in North Carolina's decision to ratify the Constitution and later sat as a justice on the Supreme Court, said that under the proposed Constitution, the president, quote, is of a very different nature from a monarch. He is to be personally responsible for any abuse of the great trust reposed in him, unquote. James Iredell is saying the President of the United States is not the King of England because the King of England is immune from impeachment. What Iredell is saying is the President under this Constitution is to be held responsible for any abuse of the great trust reposed in him. William Davey, who was at the Philadelphia Convention, talked about what he called the predominant principle on which the Constitutional Convention had provided for the single executive, that it was the most obvious responsibility of one person. He said, Davies said, that when you put the responsibility in one person, you are never at a loss to be able to fix the blame. Unquote. So the president is responsible for a wide range of responsibilities and powers that have been placed in him. And the reason he's only one person is because the founders believed that holding one person accountable was easier to manage and safer for the nation than a multiple executive. James Wilson of Pennsylvania said the executive power is better to be trusted when it has no screen. In other words, when you can clearly see exactly what the president is doing and how the president is behaving. James Wilson goes on, "Sir, we have a responsibility in the person of our president. He cannot act improperly and hide either his negligence or his inattention. He cannot roll upon any other person the weight of his own criminality. No appointment can take place without his nomination. He's responsible for every nomination he makes. Add to this, that officer is placed high and is possessed of power far from being contemptible, yet not a single privilege is annexed to his character. Far from being above the law, he is amenable to the law in his private character as a citizen, and in his public character, he is amenable by impeachment." Unquote. James Wilson nails it in terms of how broad the president's accountability and responsibility are. He's responsible for everything. He's responsible for Jeff Sessions. He's responsible for Pruitt and all the rest of them. Getting rid of these people doesn't undo what they do. The very broad range of responsibilities of the president suggest that not only is he responsible for what the Pruitts and the rest of them do, but he needs to be held accountable for it. That's why there's only one of him. I think I read this quote from George Mason yesterday at the Constitutional Convention. He's talking about the ability of the candidates to manipulate the electorate. To rig the election is the term that we hear all the time today. If there's any evidence that this election was rigged, given how close it was, and given the fact that the winner under the Constitution polled 3 million votes less than the person who came in second, then any evidence of any rigged behavior, according to what the founders said at the Constitutional Convention, would be impeachable. George Mason said, "Shall any man be above justice? Above all, shall that man be above it who can commit the most extensive injustice. When great crimes were committed, he was for punishing the principal as well as the coadjutors." In other words, you can't just punish the behavior. You got to punish the people who do it, and you got to punish the president who's responsible for what they did. In other words, we're talking about cleaning house here. That's annulment, it seems to me. There's more. We're getting close to the end of it. We've got about 15 minutes left. But there's more. The issue of high crimes and misdemeanors and its exact meaning. During the convention, James Madison made reference to the laws of England, and he made reference to Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. And Madison referred to Blackstone's commentaries as, quote, a book which is in every man's hand, unquote. Blackstone's commentaries included the phrase high misdemeanors, high crimes and misdemeanors, directly from Blackstone. According to Madison, the first and principal high misdemeanor, according to Blackstone, was maladministration of such high officers as are in public trust and employment, usually punished by the method of parliamentary impeachment, unquote. That's Blackstone. In a decision by Chief Justice John Marshall made reference to the idea of high crimes and misdemeanors, and this is exactly what Marshall said in his opinion. It is a technical term. It is used in a very old statute of that country whose language is our language, and whose laws form the substratum of our laws. It is scarcely conceivable that the term was not employed by the framers of our Constitution in the sense which had been affixed to it by those from whom we borrowed. In other words, what high crimes and misdemeanors meant to the founders is exactly what it meant in British history, in Blackstone, in British law. Other comments from state ratifying conventions suggest that those who adopted the states that adopted the Constitution looked at impeachment as a remedy for abuse of power or a breach of the public trust. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina, many of us have heard of him. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, South Carolina, stated that the impeachment power in the House, quote, reaches those who behave amiss or behave their public trust, unquote. Edmund Randolph, Governor of Virginia, chair of the convention when it opened, said in the Virginia convention that the president can be impeached if he misbehaves. He later addressed the issue of emoluments from a foreign power as violation of the constitutional prohibition in Article 1, Section 9. Mason argued that the president might use his pardoning power to pardon crimes which were advised by himself or before indictment or conviction to stop inquiry and prevent detection. We read that one before. James Iredell in the North Carolina Convention. The president must certainly be punishable for giving false information to the Senate. He is to regulate all intercourse with foreign powers. It is his duty to impart to the Senate every material intelligence he receives. If it should appear that he has not given them full information, but has concealed important intelligence, which he ought to have communicated, and by that means induced them to enter into measures injurious to the country, and which they would not have consented to had the true state of things been disclosed to them. In this case, I ask whether upon an impeachment for a misdemeanor upon such an account, the Senate would probably favor him. The reason I share that thought with you, that statement from Iredell, is because of the president's behavior internationally, both in the meetings with Kim Jong-un in Singapore and with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, when nobody knows anything about what was agreed to there? It's well over a month, and still nobody knows for sure what was agreed to there. It would seem to me that totally violates the responsibility to the president to keep the Senate informed. Now, of course, the leaders of the Senate would say that they are informed and there's nothing they need to hear beyond what they already know, because we have a Senate that is in the palm of the president's hand. But the implication of Iredell's statement here suggests that part of the responsibility which produces an impeachable offense is the responsibility of the president to the other branches of government. And it raises serious questions as to whether, in fact, the president is living up to the responsibilities of his own office. After the Constitutional Convention was ratified in 1790 and 1791, James Wilson of Pennsylvania conducted a series of lectures on law, which he used to explain the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which by this time was attached to it. And in his lectures on law, James Wilson said the following: impeachment in the United States is confined to political characters, to political crimes and misdemeanors, and to political punishment. Excuse me, I seem to be losing my voice. And to political punishment. He says the doctrine of impeachment is of high import in the constitutions of free states. On the one hand, the most powerful magistrates should be amenable to the law. On the other hand, elevated characters should not be sacrificed merely on account of their elevation. No one should be secure while he violates the Constitution and the laws. Everyone should be secure while he observes them. Unquote. No man is above the law. Result: the President of the United States does not have the power to pardon himself. Period. End of story. James Wilson. And finally, let me share this one with you. I thought this was about the clearest statement as to how broad the president's responsibilities are. Responsibilities for which he must be held accountable. Responsibilities for which the impeachment clause in the Constitution of the United States was put there by the founders. This is a statement written by Justice Joseph Story in his Commentaries on the Constitution, written in 1833. 1833, of course, is during the Jackson administration. And this is Justice Joseph Story in his Commentaries. And what he's talking about here are offenses of what he calls a political character. In other words, when we talk about political offenses or violations of the public trust, what are we talking about? Joseph Story took on that issue and said the following. It's a little bit long, but all I would ask you to think about as you listen to this is the breadth, the range of responsibilities. Story says, not but that crimes of a strictly legal nature fall within the scope of the power, but that it has a more enlarged operation and reaches what are aptly termed political offenses, growing out of personal misconduct or gross neglect, or usurpation, or habitual disregard of the public interest, various in their character, and so indefinable in their actual involutions that it is impossible to provide systematically for them by positive law, period. In other words, the president's responsibilities in office are so broad that it's impossible to outline them or lay them out in a law. By definition, the president's responsibilities are about as broad as the range covered by the word political can apply. They must be examined upon every broad and comprehensive principles of public policy and duty. This is Story again. These responsibilities must be examined upon very broad and comprehensive principles of public policy and duty. They must be judged of by the habits and rules and principles of diplomacy, or departmental operations and arrangements, of parliamentary practice, of executive custom, and negotiations of foreign as well as domestic political movements. In short, by a great variety of circumstances, as well as those which aggravate, as those which extenuate or justify the offensive acts which do not properly belong to the judicial character of the ordinary administration of justice and are far removed from the reach of municipal jurisprudence. Unquote. In other words, what Story is saying here is that the powers and responsibilities of the president are about as broad as it's possible to conceive them. And by putting the power in the person of one person, in one president, a single executive, the founders believed that they were making it easier to hold the executive, the president, responsible for his behavior in office. When you take all of this together, his responsibilities for his own behavior, his responsibilities for the behavior of those he appoints, then you come very, very close to justifying the principle of annulment. Because you're talking not only about removing a president for violations of his responsibilities of office, but you're also talking about removing the stain that behavior produced on the body politic. The president violated the public trust. That's why he's being impeached. There's no reason in the world that if impeachment is supported, if the Senate goes along with impeaching a president, there's no reason in the world why the citizens of this country should have to live continually with the product of these illegal or impeachable behaviors. We need to have a way to get rid of them all. The founders, in their own way, did it by emphasizing the broad nature of presidential responsibilities. The fact that the president's legal advisors are trying to narrow his behavior down to the issue of criminal behavior is trying to take the issue in exactly the opposite direction from what the founders intended it to be. We can't let that happen. Brett Kavanaugh can't let that happen. The public has to be brought on board. The public has to be made more aware of exactly how broad and how accountable the president is for his behavior and for the behavior of those he brings into office. When Pruitt and these other characters are forced to resign because of violations of the public trust, the president's responsible for that. He brought him in here. We elected him to fulfill the responsibilities of the office. And part of that office, a part of that responsibility is to staff his administration. If he staffs it with people who are ripping off the population, who are stealing and cheating, and treating the office with disrespect, he's responsible for that. Forcing Pruitt to resign doesn't touch the issue of the president's ultimate responsibility for that behavior. We know, for example, that now Bannon's gone. But Bannon is in almost daily contact with the president. Scaramucci's gone. But he's in frequent contact with the president. In other words, the president, by removing these people from office for violations of trust, is a sham. He's getting them out of office, but they're still influencing policy. The only way to get rid of the damage that they did is to get rid of him. End of story. It's 3:00 on a Tuesday afternoon. We have reached the end of our program. It's right at the top of the hour. I want to thank you once again for your willingness to put up with some of this. I hope that you found it informative. I know I did. Obviously, I got a little bit carried away with it, but that's the nature of the animal, I guess. Not only me, the animal, but also the material, the animal as well. For Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On, and for me, Bill Obrien, thank you so very, very much for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the network itself. If everything goes well, we'll be back together again tomorrow. I do invite you to join us. Again, have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.